House here tonight. So a very warm spring welcome to the Human Needs and Global Resources Spring Symposium, generously sponsored by the John Deere Foundation. And it's so good to have each of you here. Great to see so many familiar faces from campus, from churches that we know, interns, a whole bunch of surprise alumni showing up. So thank you. And we're just so pleased to have you all here tonight. I'm Laura Meitzner-Yoder, and I direct the Hunger Program. And for our visitors, this is a program through which students and others learn about global church response to critical human needs in their midst. And the Hunger students live and work and worship with local communities as they intern for 6 months with host organizations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. I want to acknowledge and thank all the Hunger faculty, staff, and students whose dedication has brought this symposium to fruition. Especially Jamie Huff, Laura Atkinson, Nina Montalava, patrons, Laurel Shoney, I think still all there somewhere with chairs, and Laura Petzel here, our intrepid TA who has set up the room and done all kinds of wonderful things for us tonight. And of course, the cohort of 2022 Hunger interns who warmly invite you to stay for their poster reception just after this presentation. There are snacks. And please, they especially ask that you ask them hard questions in the hallway, just outside. You'll see their posters. Ryan Juskus asked me to start by sharing these words from Ezekiel 34, verse 15. So let's hear these words together. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I will make them lie down, says the Lord God. I will seek the lost, and I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak. But the fat and the strong I will destroy. I will feed them with justice. As for you, my flock, thus says the Lord God, I shall judge between sheep and sheep, between ram and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture, but you must tread down with your feet the rest of your pasture? When you drink of clear water, must you foul the rest with your feet? And must my sheep eat what you have trodden with your feet, and drink what you have fouled with your feet? I will make with them a covenant of peace, and banish wild animals from the land, so that they may live in the wild and sleep in the woods securely. I will make them and the region around my hill a blessing, and I will send down the showers in their season. They will be showers of blessing. The trees of the field shall yield their fruit, and the earth shall yield its increase. They shall be secure on their soil, and they shall know that I am the Lord, when I break the bars of their yoke, and save them from the hands of those who enslaved them. They shall no more be plunder for the nations, nor shall the animals of the land devour them. They shall live in safety, and no one shall make them afraid. I will provide for them a splendid vegetation, so that they shall no more be consumed with hunger in the land, and no longer suffer the insults of the nations. They shall know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the house of Israel, are my people, says the Lord God. You are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, and I am your God, says the Lord God. It is good to be reminded of these words as we consider together our theme for this time tonight, decarbonization and decolonization, toward a just and generous energy transition. And we extend a very warm welcome to our alumni guests, both online and here in person, joining us tonight. Please pray with me. Creating, redeeming, sustaining God, we thank you for the good gift of this, your earth. Open our eyes and ears and make us ever more attentive to your presence and work in the world. Amen. Over to Jamie Huff.
So I have the privilege of introducing our guests tonight, and as Dr. Yoder mentioned, this year's theme for the Human Needs and Global Resources Program Symposium has been Faithful Decolonization and Cultivating Beloved Community. We first explored this theme in the same room here back in October, during which we were inspired and challenged by very special guests, Reverend Renee August and Karen Dudley from South Africa, who helped us imagine how we might embody beloved community at the tables where we gather every day to eat with friends, strangers, and enemies. This evening, we have invited 4 special guests to build on our theme and to take it in a different, important, and timely direction. So to kick things off, we've asked Dr. Ryan Juskus to set the stage for a conversation among 4 Wheaton Hunger alumni around a key question that Dr. Juskus will be asking us to consider and his panelists, which is how might we Christians who have benefited for so long from colonization and carbonization begin to decolonize and decarbonize our thought and practice. Our consideration of this question tonight will happen mostly through conversation, and we've asked our guests to draw on their unique personal, professional, and vocational experiences to offer some ideas and answers. So before I invite Dr. Juskus to share, allow me to introduce him and the 3 other distinguished guests who are joining him. I'll try to keep it brief, but I want to give you a little bit of context of who they are and where they come from. So Katerina and Ryan, if you guys could turn on your, so we could do a little, there we go, a little Wizard of Oz action for a moment. Katerina Kea was a 2009 Hunger intern and cultural anthropology major here at Wheaton. Her internship was in Ilogan, the Philippines, where she worked with the Kalahan Educational Foundation, an indigenous NGO, on forest stewardship, education for local youth, and cultivating economic opportunities, but also sustaining the environment. Currently, she's an organizer with the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, a faith-based organization that seeks to address the ongoing colonization of indigenous lands, quote, discovered by European Christian powers. She coordinates the Coalition's repair network of Christian communities that commit to reparations and support of indigenous community struggles for ecological justice. And she also pastors Wild Church in Fresno, California, on Yokuts and Mono homelands, where they worship, hear this, outdoors, near the San Joaquin River. Sounds very good to me. And seek to form beloved community there with soil, plants, waters, and creatures of the place they call home. Ryan Hobert was a 2000 Hunger intern and poli-sci international relations major. His internship was in the Central African Republic with Grace Brethren International Missions, now known as Encompass World Partners. His independent study project focused on Christian-Muslim relations with particular focus on how Muslim economic strength was shaped by differences in Muslim and Bantu cultures there. Currently, he works at the United Nations Foundation, a US-based nonprofit dedicated to supporting and advocating on behalf of the United Nations and its priorities, where he helps lead a team of 12 people who focus on international climate change and environmental issues. The UN Foundation helps to support the UN Secretary General and UN agencies on a variety of climate, environment-related topics. Ryan Juskus, who will kick it off tonight, was a 2004 Hunger intern and also an international relations major, and did his Hunger internship with Paz y Esperanza in Moyobamba, Peru, where he worked with the Construyendo una Esperanza campaign to follow up on the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work by working with survivors and family members affected by the political violence to seek reparations. Currently, he's in Princeton, New Jersey, where he is an environmental teaching fellow in the High Meadows Environmental Institute at Princeton University. As a fellow, he works on various research projects on environmental ethics and Christian approaches to environmental justice. And finally, Stefan Rao, there's Stefan, who was a 2013 Hunger intern, that's right, good, and biology major. Stefan interned with the Luke Society in Jinotepe, Nicaragua, where he joined a team that was addressing barriers to health in rural communities. As an intern, he worked with the Luke Society team on some small projects in their experimental center, where they were diversifying crops and trialing and demonstrating alternative growing practices. I'll have you know that he's a really good grower of red bell peppers. They have pictures of him all through Jinotepe, Nicaragua. I saw them myself. Currently, he lives and farms alongside a team at the nonprofit learning farm, Hungry World Farm in North Central Illinois, where they develop land care efforts, agroforestry projects, and educational opportunities across 175 acres. I wonder if you could give just a warm welcome to Ryan Juskus. And then Ryan and Katarina, you guys can go off video for a little bit, and we'll invite you to come back on as soon as Ryan is finished.
Yeah, stick with this?
Yeah, sure.
Why not? Got a lot of things. Clickers.
You good?
Yeah. All right, so I'm grateful for this chance to think with the Hunger community and the Wheaton community about climate change and colonization. I'm particularly glad to have such a great panel of Hunger alumni to engage with. And what I'd like to do in my talk here is to invite you to consider maybe a different way of understanding climate change. And then I'll sort of become the moderator and pose some questions to our panelists about their perspectives on climate change and decolonization. So in the title of my talk are the two big concepts, decarbonization and decolonization, both of which must sound very abstract. So let me bring them into focus through some stories. One story comes from my research on faith and environmental justice. Environmental justice is a movement with deep roots that go back centuries. But it coalesced as a movement in the early 1980s when black and white residents in rural Warren County, North Carolina, adapted tactics from the civil rights movement and black power movement to oppose the state's decision to resolve a toxic waste problem by dumping it in their community. At that time, no, it's the other way. No.
The other way.
Other way. I'm doing both ways. No, you
There we go.
Okay, there we go, we're in. At that time, it was the economically poorest and most heavily African-American county in the state of North Carolina. Christians like Dolly Burwell, Reverend Ben Chavis, and Reverend Brown resisted what they called environmental racism, making prayers and signs like this and singing songs. Yep, we're going the other way. There we go. Singing songs like this. The movement merged with an analogous one that was building throughout the 1970s among indigenous tribes in the American West and Southwest that were grappling with the toxic legacy of nuclear energy and oil, gas, and coal extraction on tribal lands. In the context of a series of energy crises in the 1970s, a push by the U.S. government and the fossil fuel industry for energy independence led to plans for expanded fossil fuel development in the American interior, which had been primarily agricultural and indigenous land. In a government report on the projected effects of strip mining for coal, the authors said that these places should be considered, quote, national sacrifice areas, meaning that they would be permanently destroyed in order to meet the energy demand from primarily coastal populations. An alliance of ranchers and tribes called the, quote unquote, Cowboy and Indian Alliance opposed being a national sacrifice for corporate profits and coastal consumers. At the same time, rural white farmers and miners in Appalachia adopted this same language of sacrifice zones to resist the way that strip mining for coal was destroying Appalachian lands and replacing miners with huge machines. When the black-led movement against environmental racism in the South and the East merged with the indigenous movement against energy sacrifice zones in the West and the Appalachian anti-strip mining movement, it gave birth to a powerful environmental justice movement that revealed a distinct logic of sacrifice that constitutes our modern energy system. Some people in some lands disproportionately bear the environmental, social, and health costs of energy extraction, production, and consumption, so that other people in other lands can consume and live and breathe freely and worship and work in healthier environments, where they never have to pay the full cost of a way of life that depends on fossil fuels. This movement was largely driven by the idea that lands and bodies and communities should not be sacrificed because they are in some ways sacred. More on that in a little bit. Because of negative effects of extracting, processing, transporting, burning, and wasting fossil fuels, effects like pollution, deforestation, species loss, cancers, birth defects, societies like ours that are built on fossil fuels have worked very hard to try to concentrate the human and ecological costs of fossil fuels in sacrifice zones, which are also sometimes called resource colonies. Both concepts reveal how through social, political, and economic structures we spatially distribute life and death across our fossil fuel society. When I say we, I'm talking about we who are benefit and are privileged in a petrocultural, which you'll hear about that in a minute. In light of the story I just told, I think the problem that today we think of as climate change starts to look a little bit different than how it's often depicted. In what I'll call the standard story of climate change, we're told that the main problem is that there's too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Too many carbon emissions from human activities is trapping the sun's heat inside the Earth's atmosphere, and this affects all sorts of Earth systems, from weather patterns to oceans to growing seasons, etc. The solutions then that become imaginable in this kind of standard story are trying to reduce carbon emissions, adapting to a new climate reality, and using geoengineering technologies to manage the climate. And for those who have even, I think, a cursory understanding of climate change, I hope this sounds familiar. At this point, though, I want to be very clear that while I will argue that we should describe the problem of climate change differently and go about addressing it with a more expansive set of stories, analytical tools, and interventions, I'm fully committed to and think that we should all be fully committed to urgent action to address the issues that are grouped together under this concept of climate change. And I'll assume that denying the reality of human-induced climate change and the need for urgent responses is off the table in this talk. That said, I think we should be careful when we're talking about quote-unquote anthropogenic climate change, because the human species as a whole is not the emitting agent in the history of climate change. Historically, the emitting agent is weird people, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So I call it weirdogenic climate change, if not for the fact that non-Western and non-democratic peoples are now some of the biggest carbon emitters globally. And once we recognize that countries don't emit carbon, but individuals, institutions, classes, and companies do, then it becomes clear that it's a shockingly small number of humans that emit most of the carbon. So I take off the table climate change denial, by which I mean denying that the actions of some human beings, myself included, are changing Earth systems. But there are other kinds of denial. The kinds that I'm concerned about are, one, a denial that there's anything meaningful that individuals, families, and communities can do. Let's call it a denial of agency. And two, I'm concerned about a denial of the need for fundamental changes in our own desires in how we relate to one another and the Earth. I'm concerned that the standard story we tell about climate change and even sustainability sometimes bakes these forms of denial into the framework itself. I think the standard story ends up generating this dizzying mix of despair, optimism, and a set of solutions that I think do little to transform the quality of our relationships to one another, to other creatures, and to our Creator. It also privileges certain kinds of techno-scientific knowledge and the sorts of solutions and tools that governments, international bodies, corporations, and engineers, all good people, have in their tool belts. However, given the track record, I think, of some of these entities, I'm not inclined to entrust the future of life on this planet to some of these actors, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. They can, though, and should play an essential and important role in coordinating responses, setting targets, catalyzing innovation, creating incentives, enforcing laws, things like that. But these actors, in many ways, are also the architects of the modern systems and the ways of life that are entirely dependent on fossil fuels. They're the actors who've worked to concentrate what are these kind of death-dealing costs of these systems and ways of life over there, among those people, in that place, in sacrifice zones, in resource colonies at home and abroad. So I think we've built this modern world system and way of life that's entirely dependent on fossil fuels for heat, movement, energy, and material stuff we wear, slather on, eat, heal ourselves with. Toothbrushes, shiny surfaces, synthetic fertilizers, plastics, gel pills, same-day deliveries, warm homes in winter, hot breakfasts, stretchy yoga pants, are all products of fossil fuels. Not just our planes and cars and the things we normally think of when we think of cutting down our carbon footprint. Our imaginations are so captive to fossil fuels and the powers that they afford that we have a habit of solving so many of our problems, including our problems that fossil fuels create. We end up solving them with more fossil fuels. It's for this reason that scholars of what is called the energy humanities point out that in a very real, material, and concrete, and also cultural and metaphorical sense, we are fossil fuels. Our culture is, in a word, a petroculture. Our bodies are petro-bodies. Our everyday practices are petro-practices. Our knowledges, petro-knowledges, and so on. The Petrocultures Research Group is a collective of leading scholars in the energy humanities. It's founded on the premise that energy plays a critical role in determining the shape, form, and character of our daily existence. The dominant form of energy in any given era, in our case fossil fuels, shapes the attributes and capabilities of societies in a fundamental way. Accordingly, a genuine global transition away from fossil fuels will require not only reworking our energy infrastructures, but a transformation of the petroculture itself. In addition to their physical and material impacts, fossil fuels have also shaped our values, practices, habits, beliefs, and feelings. And therefore, transitioning from fossil fuels to other sources of energy will require more than new energy technologies. We will need to transform and transition our cultural and social values at the same time. This is from these scholars. Some examples of these values, practices, habits, beliefs, and feelings that have been shaped by our use of fossil fuels are things that probably many of us just take as normal. Visiting sick family members in the hospital, eating a well-balanced diet of fruits and vegetables year-round, driving to church or picking up someone without a car to bring them to church, celebrating children's birthdays with fun decorations and goodie bags, reading books late into the night, hosting symposia in beautiful, well-lit, warm buildings, or even hosting virtual symposia, considering that the internet currently accounts for about 4% of carbon emissions and is expected to double in a few years. We are fossil fuels. We are coal, oil, and gas. Our use of buried sunshine has completely reshaped how we relate to each other, how we relate to non-human animals, the earth, how we relate to God, what we think is a desirable and good life to pursue, how we view time and future, how we love our neighbor, what sorts of work we do, our democratic values and practices, and so on. The list is almost endless. And that's what it means to live in a petroculture, a culture that swims in fossil fuels like a fish in water. The questions I'd like to draw some of our attention to are these. To what extent have we become petro-Christians with petro-pieties, petro-theologies, and petro-missiologies? To what extent is the God that we profess to worship a product of petroculture? To what extent have we normalized the sacrificial cost-shifting dynamics that constitute our petroculture? The answers to these questions may not all be doom and gloom, okay? Things deserving repentance. In fact, I think the most important task is not only to name the wrong turns, errors, and idolatries from which we should repent, but to do the difficult work of distinguishing between the good, the bad, and the ugly. Longer average lifespans around the globe, even if still very unequal. More food, medicine, and books available to more people. An ability to survive extreme weather. These are some of the things that would be largely unthinkable without the use of fossil fuels. But the good and the bad are so deeply intermixed and intertwined that parsing them out is difficult, essential, even existential. So when I ask to what degree have we become petro-Christians, I'm not seeking some wholesale sort of condemnation of American Christianity or a wholesale condemnation of our mothers and fathers or the modern missions movement or the movement out of which the hunger program developed, the movement to address global poverty, conflict, and exploitation. To ask about the extent of our commitment to petro-Christianity and petro-theology is not to condemn. It's to recognize that Christian communities, especially in the U.S., are entangled and meshed with fossil fuels, and the world that was built upon them were enmeshed. So that's a place to start. But rather than throwing up our hands in resignation or anxiously seeking our own purity, becoming aware of our enmeshment should lead us, I think, to ask how we got here and where we can go from here. I can't fully answer that here, but I would like to zoom in on one of the ways that I think we got here and where we can go from here. And it's become normal for many of us, I think, to shift the full costs of our ways of life and worship onto other people and other places. People who live in sacrifice zones and resource colonies, and maybe some of us have lived in those places. One of the ways this became normal was through some very intentional practices of keeping those costs and the places that bear them out of view. Those of you who were at the dinner heard me talk a little bit about this. It's so normal that we barely even recognize, one, that we generate so many ecological and social costs that we ourselves don't pay, and two, that it has taken work to keep the world's sacrifice zones invisible. This practice was learned early on. Historian Barbara Fries tells about the early coal mining towns in northern England, where we see some of the earliest changes that were taking place during the first great shift from wood to coal. After cataloging all the silent and spectacular ways that coal miners died inside the mines, collapses, odorless gases, explosive gases, suffocation, Fries recounts how mine managers and owners pressured newspapers to stop covering these disasters for fear of affecting morale, interrupting the coal supply. And so was formed one of the most powerful strategies in the playbook, keeping the costs invisible. Because some people inevitably notice the costs. Another strategy was to focus attention not on present pain, but on future possibilities of a world moved and heated and accelerated by coal, self-moving machines. So if practices of invisibilization were effective, stories of progress and human advancement could be told that would in effect justify present sufferings in the name of an always just about to crest utopian wave. And if practices of invisibilization and stories of progress fail to assuage people's guilt and unease with the sacrifices undergirding the fossil fuel world coming into existence, then a good dose of cynicism could do the trick. Suffering is natural. The death of the weak is natural. It's even good for the species, for only the strongest and fittest survive. The death of the poor and weak and outcast is just the way of the world, the way things develop. It's not a matter of ethics or morals. It's just the outworking of a nature that is red in tooth and claw. These are the strategies of invisibilization, justification, and naturalization. Making the human and environmental costs invisible, justifying the costs that refuse to remain invisible, and when all else fails, making their suffering and death over there appear to be as natural as gravity. Our petrocultures have inherited and perfected these strategies. To what extent have they entered even into our petrotheologies as well? The Notre Dame historian Darren Dochuk in his book, Anointed with Oil, gives a 600-page account of how two opposing ways of harnessing the power and wealth of oil has shaped every aspect of American Christianity over the past 150 years or so, including our culture wars today. Recommend the book, it's quite long. Oil is a material factor in all of this in ways that his book only begins to unearth. We would do well to grapple with the story Dochuk tells about oil and Billy Graham's ministry. What if climate change isn't primarily about greenhouse gases, but is instead about petroculture's sacrificial shadow side going global and becoming uncontainable? What if climate change is the outcome of transforming lands into resource colonies and sacrifice zones? What responses become imaginable and urgent when we describe climate change in this way? Understanding how we became a petroculture and petro-Christians can inform where we might go from here. If we think climate change is primarily a problem about too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then we'll fail to address the problems of sacrifice zones, cost shifting, and resource colonies that have been essential, constitutive features of the fossil fuel world. We'll propose and embrace solutions to climate change that may very well prolong and intensify these sacrificial dynamics, keeping the renewable energy transition sacrifices invisible, justifying its costs with retooled progress stories about sustainable solar utopias, and when all else fails, just chalking up the human costs and the ecological costs to nature. There's no alternative. Transitions hurt. The poor will always be with you. There will be blood. Or the eco-nationalist idea that I'm just going to build bigger walls and look out for my people over here. In his chilling recent book, Cobalt Red, Siddharth Kara reveals that the same sacrificial logics that characterize petroculture are shaping today's battery revolution. In the last part of my talk, I want to ask, where is Jesus in all of this? We're glad to be able to talk about Jesus here. I'll begin to answer this by returning to the multiracial coalition and often women-led groups who built the environmental justice movement. Before it became a movement about policies and procedures for distributing environmental harms more equitably, the EJ movement was driven by a much more radical set of ideas and practices that are spiritual and theological in nature. They weren't just NIMBYists who said, not in my backyard, dump it somewhere else. Instead, they said, not in anybody's backyard. If we're producing harms that shouldn't go in anyone's backyard, then we shouldn't be producing them to begin with. Environmental justice shouldn't be fundamentally about getting the state to ensure that environmental harms are distributed relatively more evenly. The early EJ movement said lives and land should not be sacrificed to feed insatiable desires because they're sacred. They meant different things by this, of course, sacred, and they gave different accounts of what makes lands and lives sacred, but they mostly agreed that the value of lives and lands does not derive only from their utility in human economies. Rather, the worth and dignity and value of lives and lands derive from their location within relational, life-sustaining networks of human and more than human communities. Through ethnographic fieldwork, I studied one particular group, a Christian creation care organization named Restoring Eden, that was so disturbed by the sacrificial dynamics that operate in the white Appalachian coal fields and the black residential neighborhoods surrounding coal plants in Birmingham, Alabama, that they partnered with scientists, residents, and local organizations and recruited Christian college students, some of them from Wheaton, to spend their spring break going door to door filling out household health surveys. In this way, they produced the first ever household level data on the community health effects of coal mining. In contexts where the coal industry actively worked to keep the true costs of coal invisible, Restoring Eden combined short-term service trips, citizen science, and creation care ministry to make visible the true costs of coal in numbers, charts, and graphs. Their findings, which were published in peer-reviewed health journals and covered by media outlets and taken up by activist groups, helped to replace the narrative that until then had been so essential to the coal industry, that because there's an inherent conflict between the environment and the economy, any rational person would choose jobs over trees. By helping to make the true human costs of coal visible in charts, numbers, and graphs, thus practicing science as a form of Christian witness and neighbor love, Restoring Eden helped to shift the narrative. How many cancers in kids born with heart defects is coal worth? I started studying Restoring Eden after their health studies in Appalachia, when they were starting to organize stakeholders to carry out similar studies in the African American neighborhoods in North Birmingham. After a visit to the Equal Justice Initiative's Museum and Lynching Memorial, Restoring Eden adapted a phrase from EJI, calling these studies citizen science as a form of restorative truth-telling. There's much more that I could say about these studies, how they came about, the impact of them, and what meaning people made of them, but I'm going to focus only on something that Sarah, one of the Restoring Eden organizers, said after we visited a Black Baptist church in the Sacrifice Zone of North Birmingham earlier that morning. I had asked Sarah why she, a young Latina woman from East Tennessee, would move to Birmingham with no money, no job security, no place to live even, and almost no chance of success, given that the families that owned the coal companies in Alabama were the wealthiest and most powerful in the state. She responded, speaking of the residents, that they're treated as sacrificable communities, but they're not expendable people. And then she pointed me to the sermon that the Baptist pastor preached earlier that morning on Christ and his cross, all in a sacrifice zone. When environmental justice activists work to love the lives and the lands that our petroculture sets aside for sacrifice, they reveal something, I think, that's very important, which is that the resource colonies and sacrifice zones in our world are not just sites of victimization. They're sites of concentrated conflict between rival logics or ecologies of sacrifice. Mind you, the word sacrifice comes from the Latin words sacra, which means sacred, and facere, which means to make, meaning to make sacred. Sacra, facere. So while our petroculture treats sacrifice zones like the Appalachian coal fields in North Birmingham as places to shift their costs in a utilitarian version of sacrifice, people who live in sacrifice zones and love the creatures slated for sacrifice, and groups like Restoring Eden and Christians for the Mountains who accompany them, reveal a very different logic of sacrifice. It's a logic that prioritizes the transformation of sacrifice zones into places of abundant life. It's a logic that I see well represented in Scripture. For example, the writer of the Epistle to the Hebrews highlights what is significant about the location of Christ's crucifixion, Golgotha. Hebrews 13:12 says that Jesus suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. This place outside the gate is very significant. Golgotha was not inside the city walls of Jerusalem. Outside the gate is where the trash was piled, where the carcasses from the temple sacrifices were thrown, where the executions happened, and probably where the outcasts hung around. It's where all the dirt and the detritus was concentrated so that those inside the city walls could live well without contamination. In the Levitical teaching, outside the gate is a place where people become unclean, where they get contaminated, and from which they must be cleansed. But that's exactly where Jesus goes. Jesus makes the place of contamination into the site of salvation. The writer of Hebrews thinks Christians should follow. Therefore, let us go to him outside the gate and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, no enduring city, but we seek the city that is to come. If a city must externalize its costs in order to endure or last, then the city of God is not a city in that sense. It is a city that follows a very different kind of logic, with a different pattern of worship, a different set of ethics. Quote, through him then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Nobody has drawn attention to the implications of this passage more than the Puerto Rican theologian Orlando Costas in his book, Christ Outside the Gate. Costas draws out the spatial, geographical dimensions of Christ's movement outside the gate and the implications this has for how we think about the location of salvation. And I think we would do well to grapple with these geographical aspects of salvation today. Golgotha, outside the gate, is a lot like today's resource colonies and sacrifice zones. It's a place where rival logics of sacrifice bear down on the body of Christ. John's Gospel records one of those logics in the mouth of the high priest Caiaphas. Quote, it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. This is a logic of scapegoating, cost shifting, surrogacy. It's the same logic that creates and justifies sacrifice zones. It's the logic that executed Christ as an enemy of the state and the religious authorities. But it's not the only logic at work in Golgotha, outside the gate, as it's not the only logic operating in sacrifice zones today. What we also see is a God who goes into that unholy, polluted place and subverts the false sacrificial logic of scapegoating by transforming that place into the site of God's salvation. In Christ, we see God go into the darkest sacrifice zone and make it sacred, taking on all the forces of sin, death, and their power, and showing them to be the enemies of true, divine, eternal life. And then the Spirit raises Christ from the dead also outside the gate as the first fruits of the new creation. If the analogy holds between Golgotha and sacrifice zones, then we can say that it's characteristic of God to move toward sacrifice zones and transform them into sacred zones. And while we're called to follow Christ into these places, the point is not to become a martyr. Christ died once for all. Our sacrifices, as the author of Hebrews says, are giving praise to the Lord and doing good to one another, sharing what we have, or as Jesus put it, loving God and loving our neighbor, especially the neighbor left for dead. I mentioned one type of practice that I think resonates with Hebrews' idea of a sacrifice. It's restoring Eden's citizen science as restorative truth-telling. It's a way of making visible the true costs of fossil fuels and subverting the justificatory narratives that cloud our moral vision, and doing so in a way that creates encounters between those who live in sacrifice zones and those who do not, joining together where our petroculture tries to keep separate. So let me bring this full circle as I close. The big concepts of this, in the title of this session, are decarbonization and decolonization. I hope these stories help you understand why I think it's essential that we approach these together. Decolonization generally means understanding and repairing the damage done by centuries of hard and soft forms of colonization, referring as much to economic and political realities as to imaginative and epistemic ones. Decarbonization usually refers to reducing carbon emissions through economic policy, and technological interventions. But I suggest that decarbonization also ought to happen at the level of imagination and culture. The theologian James Cone once wrote, "The logic that led to slavery and segregation in the Americas, colonization and apartheid in Africa, and the rule of white supremacy throughout the world is the same one that leads to the exploitation of animals and the ravaging of nature." Reprising Cone's idea, we could say that the same logic that produced climate change also produced colonization. And so to make any real progress on one will require undoing it together with the other. In the standard story, climate change is primarily about the gap between sustainable and unsustainable amounts of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Let's call it the hole in the sky. But if we look only up at the hole in the sky and don't attend to sacrifice zones, to social inequities, and to our own need for the Spirit to transform our lives, our desires, and our communities, then we're liable to embrace so-called solutions that keep sacrificing some groups of people and some lands in order to sustain the rest of us. Yes, let's look at the hole in the sky, but let's not fixate on it. Instead, let's focus on the relationship between the holes in the ground, in our societies, and in our hearts. I think that's the way to bear witness to the good news of a God who goes into sacrifice zones and transforms them into the places of new creation. In other words, our approach to climate change shouldn't move from the sky on down, but from the sacrifice zones on out. What if we made solving the greenhouse gas problem a happy byproduct of eliminating sacrifice zones? Thank you. So I'm hoping our panelists may push back on some of this or contribute to it or do something entirely different. But we're going to shift gears a little bit, and if there's particular questions you might have, I would say write them down. You can get to them after we have some panel discussion.
Ryan and Katerina, you guys can come on now. And you're in charge, right, Dr. Juskus?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so grateful to our three Overland panelists, and just want to begin with kind of a quick answer, if you will, to a question. If you could tell us who you are, what your work or ministry is, and your unique vantage point or the perspective that you bring to this topic of climate change and decolonization or both. Maybe I'll start with Stefan, and then why don't we go to Kat and then Ryan.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Stefan Rao. It's a pleasure to be here together. And thank you, Dr. Juskus, for your sharing. I work with an organization called Hungry World Farm. It's located 2 hours southwest of Wheaton, and Hungry World Farm is a nonprofit learning farm that seeks to inspire action toward healthy connections between land, soil, plants, animals, and human communities. I joined the Hungry World Farm team 5 years ago as a produce grower, focusing mostly on growing vegetables and helping to care for a blueberry patch. In my current role, I now help Hungry World Farm take care of and learn more from the 175 acres we seek to steward. So I come to this conversation bringing my experience with farming and land care alongside a team of humans, and also alongside living soils, plants, animals, insects, and microbial communities. I come recognizing the privilege I have given the close connection I share with the Hungry World farmland, a connection to land which many people do not experience or no longer experience.
Kat.
Thank you for your presentation, Ryan. I really appreciate that and the chance to be able to co-present with these awesome other panelists. My name is Katerina Heya, and like James said in the beginning, I work as an organizer with a faith-based coalition called the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery, and we accompany Indigenous communities seeking land justice, facing extractive industries like mining or deforestation on their lands, pollution of their waters, accompany them and really seek to animate and mobilize church communities. We grew out of Anabaptist and Mennonite church communities, was part of our origin, but we're kind of expanding ecumenically now within various Christian traditions to really mobilize these communities to respond to Indigenous invitations to relationship and to partnership, seeing our struggles as bound up together. So that's one hat that I bring. And then I also pastor Wild Church in Fresno. And like in my introduction, we worship outdoors near a river and really seek to reconnect our faith and our Christian practice with care and with kinship with the land and creatures in the place where we live. And so my unique vantage point is, as a pastor seeking to address climate change through the formation of Christian community, Christ-centered community, reconciling not only with human neighbors, but with the land. and with God, and then also as someone involved in social movements, creating structural and cultural change alongside Indigenous communities. And I will say that, just to echo what Ryan shared in his presentation, that many of these communities interpret the climate crisis through the broader lens of colonization. So that's one of the lenses that I'm reading.
Great, thank you, Kat. Ryan, why don't you tell us what you're up to?
Great, thanks, and lots to react to. It's exciting. So I'm Ryan Hobart. I live in Washington D.C. with my wife Carrie, who's also both a Wheaton and Hunger alum, and two girls, Adelaide and Elsa. Ryan and I went to church for a while at an Anglican church here in the district. I work at a place called the United Nations Foundation, which is a US-based nonprofit, and our role is to help support the UN and advocate on its behalf. I work specifically on climate change and environmental issues. And a lot of what we do is work on the international stage, whether it's around the Paris Agreement, which is the agreement on climate change that the UN member states reached in 2015, on issues of climate as it relates to food or ocean, and things like supporting climate science through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the interesting thing about the UN is that it's both what I work on, which is working with the UN on climate change issues. The Secretary General of the UN is a huge proponent of climate action. Lots of agencies do lots of different things on climate. But interestingly, it's also one of the prime venues over the last 75 years for decolonization. There's actually a whole process post-World War II that was dedicated to decolonizing and assisting countries who wanted to transition towards self-governance and independence to help them do that. And interestingly enough, that process ended in the 1990s because they essentially ran out of countries that raised their hand and said they wanted to set up on their own. So I think the UN's interesting because it has both of those characteristics.
Great, thank you so much. So I have a question for any of our panelists. Please feel free to respond. But just wondering about some of the commitments that you bring to your work and how those commitments shape your approach to the problems of climate change or colonization or both in some way. So what are the sort of commitments that you bring to your work? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I can start. I would say I bring a commitment to seeking the health and well-being of all. So not only the well-being of my team, but I desire to see flourishing for all humans, and what I've heard Ryan mentioned as the more than human creation, pursuing a vision of a healthy world for all. I bring a commitment to learning from the particular land I'm interacting with. I desire to learn about the living systems and communities around me, and to let conversation with the land shape my approach and practices. I see my work as partnering with the land and the creatures who inhabit that land, and I see those creatures actually as fellow participants and teammates in pursuing a healthier world. I'm committed to learning from the patterns and cycles, systems and rhythms in the natural world around me. I'm committed to learning from and alongside fellow farmers, ranchers, gardeners, land stewards, and learning from the experiences they have working alongside land. And I just bring a deep care and respect for farmers and the work that they do, and a desire to see them flourish. I bring a commitment to pursuing social, ecological, and economic health and viability. So in my experience, demonstrating deep attentive care to living systems while developing and sustaining viable farm enterprises that thrive not only socially and ecologically, but also economically is not simple. Some farmers and ranchers are succeeding in this work though, and I'm learning a lot from them. So yeah, I just really desire to see farmers pursue economic viability in their farming enterprises.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I think some of my commitments include, the first one is acting from a posture of interdependence versus independence, of recognizing the ways that myself as a human and human communities are interdependent with other living systems. Of, Stefan mentioned soil and the other creatures that he works with on the farm. And I think of, the basic building blocks of life, of water, of air, of these necessities that connect us all. And I can see, related to climate, the ways that the dominant economic systems of the world are really set up to convince us that we're separate somehow, and that, that we have unlimited resources and that unlimited growth is necessary for progress, that somehow we live outside of the ecological economy, or the economy of air, water, soil, plants, animals, and that we can keep on extracting resources indefinitely as long as we need to further economic growth and progress. But I believe that actually the ecology of Earth is the reality, or is the limited system, the closed loop system of interdependence that actually affects all of our health ultimately, and that we're running out of sacrifice zones, that ultimately I'm impacted by my neighbor's toxic water or air of what's been polluted there, because private property doesn't privatize pollution. And I lean into the quote from Aboriginal activists in Australia that really also get at this sense of interdependence in our work together. You all may have heard this one. It's pretty commonly used. I probably first heard it in Hunger, I'm not sure. But this is credited to Aboriginal activists as saying, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come because our liberation is bound up together, then let us work together. So that sense of our liberation is bound up together really guides much of my work. And then I'll also just say, I was looking back at the Hunger Covenant that my class made in 2008, and there's this great phrase in there that I feel like I've really taken to heart, that we created before our hunger journey. And it says, listening to the unheard voices and knowing them by name. So really just seeking a posture of listening, of humility, of respect, of valuing those most impacted. And I hear in that, a sense of finding Christ on the margins, listening to Jesus amongst those who are oppressed or disinherited, and really believing that they may have perspectives and lenses on reality that can help us all see more clearly from the dominant culture. So I'll just name those main commitments.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to repeat a lot of the things, but maybe come at it from a slightly different perspective. So one is come at this from a global perspective. I think climate change clearly is a global commons issue. We're not going to solve it in one country. And that's where maybe and as Kat was just saying, we're bound together in this. This is a humanity-wide struggle, and we can't do it without others, whether it's on the emissions side or the solutions to building resilient, more adapted societies to the climate we're going to face. Secondly, I would say justice. Climate change is an incredibly unjust phenomenon. It's those who have contributed the least to the climate problem are the ones that suffer the most. And so it's something that we can't just stand by and ignore, especially when we're the ones who are largely creating the problem and imposing it on others who have done very, very little to contribute to it. And then the last, which has been said in different ways, is we're part of nature. We're not separate from it. It's not a problem out there. Human health is the health of nature. All of these things are intertwined. We can't have unhealthy ecosystems, an unhealthy natural environment, and expect to have healthy, thriving humans.
Right, so I have a question that in many ways is going to kind of invite you to respond or push back in some ways against my talk and the perspective I'm promoting here. But it strikes me that the Hunger program comes out of kind of a movement in the post-World War II era of thinking about development, international development, global poverty, and things like that. How do you respond to that? And there are all sorts of ways to do that through modernization technologies and kind of bringing the West to the rest idea. And I think the Hunger program grew out of that and said, you know what, we need to think let's draw on our own sort of biblical texts, let's draw on our own traditions to try to think about human flourishing and poverty and conflict in sort of Christian ways, in relational ways, where sort of human needs and economic issues and whatnot are deeply bound up with relational issues, psychological questions, relationships and whatnot. And so it struck me that Hunger in many ways was trying to develop sort of a Christian approach to the question of development. One of the things I have noticed, I think, when it comes to climate change is that I tried to name this kind of standard story of climate change, right? We could probably name that maybe in different ways. And the point again is not to say that it needs to address it should be any less urgent. That is not what I'm saying at all. But I do think there's something important in the way that we frame these issues sometimes. And so in my talk, I tried to kind of propose one way to frame climate change that I think does draw on Christian resources, on text, and what I believe is true about the human being, about creation and earth. You may approach that differently, and so I would invite you to kind of push back or contribute or respond in some way to the talk that I gave, or even ask me a question, if you will. But I have this feeling that in the same ways we sort of thought about the international development question, and kind of really brought like a critical theological type analysis to that. Have we done that with climate change? And if we do it, would it look any different? So this would be your time to either push back or say kind of how you in particular take Christian practices or principles into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I can come in here. So, I mean, I really appreciate what you said, Ryan. I think primarily, though, you're talking about the byproduct of creating the energy that we use in our modern societies for our well-being, and that's a really important thing. And I think the descriptor sacrifice zones is apt. I think that's exactly right. What you're not talking about so much is the impacts of the warming of the planet on the poorest through the climate change phenomenon. And so I think that's where that's where there are a number of considerations. I was actually in an event earlier today at the Danish embassy where they were talking about security issues in the context of climate change, and they actually invited a bunch of small island developing states. There were a number of Caribbean, Pacific representatives, and there was this really interesting discussion about climate change as a security issue, particularly for these small, low-lying islands who are, in some cases, because of sea level rise, going to have to entirely relocate to some other place. And you could just imagine the complexity of the international legal issues that are involved in relocating an entire country over the next probably 60, 70, 80 years, right? With the level of sea level rise we're going to see. It's things like that. It's things like the drought that we're seeing in the Horn of Africa, which some numbers just came out about, showing that something like 40,000 people just in Somalia have died from the drought, which hasn't actually even been declared a famine yet, which has been a multi-year process, which has been a chronic thing on the Horn of Africa, but is made worse by climate change. It's things like the cyclone, the longest cyclone that's ever been around anywhere in the world, since we measure these things, that hit Madagascar and Mozambique and Malawi and has killed hundreds of people and has thrown societies in chaos. So I think I think you're exactly right. There's the sacrifice zones in the creation of the energy that we use for modern life. And then there are the sacrifice zones that are the impacts of climate change once those greenhouse gases have been emitted and they do their work. And I actually think that on the byproduct side, there's actually a lot we can do. There's nothing inherently, and this is where I would push back maybe a little bit on you. I'm not sure that there's anything inherently petrochemical about our society. However, we love and depend on energy. And so if we can find other sources of energy that are less damaging, we will have made progress. Now, the question, and then I'll stop talking because I'm talking too much, but the question is, what are the byproducts of the new energy economy that we need to be very careful about? And you mentioned cobalt in Congo. I think we're seeing in a lot of other places, these rare earth minerals in particular that you need for battery technologies. There are other examples of things like that. But what are the trade-offs as we move into a decarbonized world? What are the trade-offs, and where do we need to pay particular attention about the kind of byproducts of the new energy economy that we're creating?
Great, thanks so much, Ryan. I appreciate that. And Kat, I'm wondering if I put you on the spot to respond.
Yeah, I really appreciate what I'm forgetting Ryan, what Ryan was just sharing about lifting up the ways that sacrifice zones are created in both scenarios, both by the climate crisis and by the byproducts of our quest for sources of energy, and regardless, there are communities that, as they say, are hit first and are hit worst. And so looking at why is it that, the most vulnerable, those vulnerabilities are amplified in both scenarios. And I think the hunger program, to your point, Ryan, Juskus, that you have raised, the hunger program has developed kind of critiques of maybe the dominant paradigms to development. I do believe that we need to draw from both old and new, those old critiques, and that some of those can still apply in the case of climate crisis. For example, I remember, at least in my hunger program years, a strong emphasis on what are Christians willing to risk? What are we willing to perhaps even sacrifice, to use your language, or lose for the sake of our neighbors? What are we willing to let go of, relinquish, or release, such as embracing a more simple lifestyle? And I think leading up to this talk, one of the things you posed to us as panelists is just a sense of suspicion of solutions to the climate crisis that don't ask us to lose anything, or don't ask us to let go of something. And I see the, first world countries, or quote unquote, or global north, however you might say it, that our lifestyles and our consumption habits continue to contribute towards the creation of sacrifice zones, whether it's through extraction of lithium or cobalt in the Congo, or resources for electric vehicles or solar panels, and also through the resources like fossil fuel extraction. So, to the other Ryan's point, looking at how do we get our energy, where does our energy come from, and what are the impacts of that energy? And then as Christians, as people who seek to follow Jesus, how can we turn our lives, in the example of Jesus, into a living sacrifice for the ultimate hope of no more sacrifice zones? As Romans, I think Romans 12 talks about, our act of worship, which I believe is not just in church, but with our whole lives, is to become a living sacrifice, laying our life down with love for the sake of life. So I think that would just be a theological, maybe, critique or challenge to this paradigm that you're framing for us here, that also has deep roots in the hunger program and history.
Yeah, and I think I'd just like to add to, when we think about the commandment to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, I find myself too, in my work, I think, thinking about, well, maybe humans aren't my only neighbors, and thinking often of the non-human neighbors as well. And find myself inspired by the work that those neighbors are doing. Just I feel humbled as humans getting to participate alongside the creatures that we're living and working alongside, and I feel like they, in their very existence, doing what they do, are contributing to a healthier world. So just recognizing, the reality of the more than human neighbors as well.
Great, I love this, and I hope you see that, right, I think there's a robust discussion to be had about what we bring to this work, how we frame it, how we think about it, how we can kind of even push back against each other's ideas, and that's one of the things I think we need friction. You need friction to move in any direction, and so if the friction is just keeping you stuck because it's pulling, I'm for and I'm against, well, that's not good friction. You need friction that's moving things in a direction, and so good to have friction going into more or less the same direction. I take that as a lesson from the civil rights movement, which had lots of different wings to it, but it was all more or less moving in similar directions, and so that friction creates movement. And so I think you can see that here and appreciate that from each of you here. So I have one last question for each of our panelists, because I want to leave about 15 minutes or so for some Q&A with the audience. And I wonder if you can leave us, kind of briefly, something you either had to learn or unlearn along the way as you're doing your work, something you've had to learn or unlearn. And thinking specifically, let's say, about juniors or seniors, hunger students or Wheaton students more broadly, staring at what happens after graduation. If you would have advice or wisdom for them. So something you've had to learn or unlearn, and a piece of advice or wisdom for those who are staring at the end of their education. While you all are thinking about that, I'll kind of see the audience as well. So if you had any questions for us, write them down, get them ready. We'll turn it over to you here in a minute.
Somebody's got to go. Maybe I'll just take one of them. The learn unlearn thing is throwing me for a loop. So I think in terms of advice, what I remember being in college and sort of feeling like it wasn't real life, and like I was sort of waiting for things to actually start. And actually hunger was different because you're kind of thrown out there and you are exposed to all kinds of things outside of the Wheaton bubble, which is really helpful. But I would just encourage you not to think of it as a time, not to feel anxiety about if you were like me, and to really appreciate the time you can spend thinking about your faith, your commitments, the world, what you're studying, the relationships that you're building, and really try to be fully present in that. So it's sort of the opposite of advice about what to do next.
I love that. Yeah, I think I'll try to tackle all three questions and remember them. In terms of learning and unlearning, I'll just share just a brief story because it's fresh on my mind. I'm coming back this week from a trip to Pasadena where I was part of a group, a faith-based delegation from our coalition accompanying an Apache group called Apache Stronghold, an indigenous group from the Southwest in Arizona whose land is being threatened by a multinational copper mining company, Rio Tinto, and a subsidiary company, Resolution Copper, threatens this destruction of their sacred site, their land where they've worshipped and held ceremony and prayers for millennia, since time immemorial, as they say. Because of the history of colonization, they don't have legal rights to that land. It's the property of the federal government under the Forest Service. And in a backroom deal, it was traded. There was a land swap deal in 2014 attached to a must-pass defense appropriation bill. Long history behind that in 2014 in Congress. But their land was traded by the government and given to this copper mining company pending environmental impact statements and so on. So they've been challenging it in the courts. And one of the things that struck me in just listening to that, seeing signs in front of the courthouse that said, the land is our church. There were signs there that said that. It just struck me, and visiting that land myself last year, praying there, camping there, that the sense of that land is sacred. I don't think I grew up with that necessarily in the Christian church. There was a sense that, that we will go to heaven after our death, but there wasn't a sense that we could sense the sacredness of the earth, or that sense that, like Ryan spoke to, of new creation, of heaven coming to earth, being part of God's ultimate dream for reality, and what part of what Christ came for with redemption. So I think part of my learning and unlearning is just that there's so much to learn from the people who have tended and stewarded these lands, wherever we call home in North America, for thousands of years, that they've learned some things that that they can teach us. And I learned that on my hunger internship, coming back from the Philippines, living in an Indigenous community, that there are ancient ways of being that Indigenous people still remember, that tie us together in sacred relationship with the earth, that I believe we have a lot to learn from. And so that's part of my ongoing learning journey and part of my own decolonization as they seek to also decolonize the lands where they live. And yeah, in terms of advice, I would just say, start with the place where you live, start with the place that you call home, and go from there. I think each of the places we call home is a microcosm of global issues and themes and global challenges. The deeper we go, the deeper we put roots downward, the farther our branches outward. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy and enjoy, conversations with college students. You can find us at wildchurchfresno.org and find my contact info there. And yeah, learn the places where you live, learn what watershed you're in, the treaties with Indigenous peoples there, who was removed previously, where they are now. To Ryan's point, are there sacrifice zones in your community? How can you get engaged? Where does your food come from? All of these just basic issues that we don't always learn in college, but the Hunger program can prepare us for through international exposure and bringing those questions home locally and connecting them globally. Yeah.
And I'd say I've had a couple mistakes farming that I've had to relearn some things. But basically, I think that I've had the tendency at points alongside others to kind of expect that that I can get what I want from land, or I can do what I want with it. And this, on a number of occasions, led me to some really aggressive tillage, let's say, that inflicted damage on the land that I continue to notice. The soil compaction and the thistles that try to outcompete other plants because of the poor soil function. So I've had to continue to learn that land is not simply there for us to use as we'd like, or for us to produce what we'd like. And I've instead had to see more about that the land has needs, and to look to soil health and function and what a particular soil needs in order to be healthy, rather than simply, let's say, what nutrients a plant needs or what soil disturbance is necessary in order to get a crop established. So I'm coming to see the land more as a living system of many diverse relationships, and learning how to tend to those living relationships within soils. And I'd say to Hunger interns, you're on a good journey, and taking one step at a time is going to be a good thing. You're gonna be headed in a good direction.
We have 10 minutes-ish. Are there any questions from the audience? To any of our panelists?
So I was wondering, you seem to have engaged a lot with dealing with corporate entities. How do you find yourself doing this work of decarbonization and also engaging with imperialism?
Yeah, so this
Sorry, can you repeat the question? That was a little hard to hear from you.
Didn't finish that.
Yeah, I think that the question was sort of, I may have emphasized the role of kind of corporate groups or large groups, right? And so the question here being like in our own more like individual or personal lives, is that what you're getting at? Things that we commit to sort of decarbonize.
Imperialism also in like a military sense as well. So how do you critique that and engage with that?
Yeah. So think about imperialism. How do we critique that? Amitabh Ghosh wrote this book, Climate Change, a number of years ago. The unthinkable, goodness, for some reason, the title of it, whatever, it doesn't matter. But he's keenly interested in this question about imperialism in a way that interests me, because he read the Paris climate agreements next to Pope Francis's Laudato Si, and read them both as kind of texts and tried to compare them and think about the sort of worlds in which they operate. And he's not a Christian, but it was very interesting because what he found in Laudato Si was really a very kind of incisive critique of imperialism and a need to come up with a different sense of what it means to live freely, what freedom is, that isn't just about consumption, about our own choice, that kind of thing, but different conceptions of freedom that in which kind of concern for others and for man is sort of baked into it. Versus what he saw in the Paris Climate Agreement, which is in many ways what he felt like in the Paris Climate Agreement, there's a sort of agreement about who is in control around the world today and who will continue to be in control. So are there ways in which certain kinds of climate politics might actually maintain imperialistic sort of global geopolitical relationships? That's a concern that I share that concern, which is why I'm trying to point towards maybe other ways of naming climate change and making other forms of action possible. It's not to say that the Paris Climate Accords don't have a very important role. I think they do in setting targets, certainly. But in terms of kind of maintaining a certain kind of global geopolitical order, I don't think they're going to interrupt that in any way. And especially when you look at militarization, this actually is one of the things that really comes out in Steph Karma's new book on cobalt, is particularly at these mining sites, sacrifice zones are deeply, deeply militarized. Private militaries, usually, sometimes state militaries, but this is how companies operate. You have to, in order to keep places invisible, what's going on, you're not going to have to militarize them. So it does become quite dangerous work in that sense, which just makes it harder, making the cost visible. It becomes harder and more dangerous.
Can I just react to that? Is that all right?
Yes, please.
So I guess I would encourage people to read the Paris Agreement, because it's actually, some of it is about targets, setting, things like that. A lot of it is actually about equity and justice and fairness. And I'm not arguing that through multilateralism you can solve all the world's problems, not at all. But I do think that we can't ignore, I guess I would interrogate a little bit what part of something like the Paris Agreement is imperialistic, if it's in the sense that it preserves the order that the post-World War II international order that we have. Yes, because we don't have another one, but I think, or if it's the idea that, corporations and other actors are, they are not the signatories, the governments of the world are the signatories, but that they are active. I think that is a real point of, of disagreement among different groups, different countries. To what extent do you let the private sector act to engage in solving these problems? I think that's a legitimate question. That's a big one, but that's largely left to countries and how they regulate the private sector. And there are lots of references to, to indigenous groups, to women, other things. So I would just interrogate that a little bit. And then the other thing I would just say, which is a little bit related to what I said earlier, but I think it's important to question how we're going to make this transition happen. But we absolutely need a fundamental transformation in the way that we produce energy, use our land, protect our forests. These are all things that we absolutely have to do if we don't want a really, really challenging world, as I said, especially for the most vulnerable. And so I think there are a lot of trade-offs. There are a lot of tough things about how you use the land, whether it's for energy or for food or for nature, and there are a lot of different examples of that. But I just want to reemphasize that I'm very convinced, particularly just as an IPCC report just landed again this week, that we have to make some really radical changes in how we do all of those things if we want an Earth that's livable for our children in the years to come.
One more question. Yeah, so that looks like we have time for one more, right? So, right here. Yep, Alex. You got a question? Oh, microphone, yes.
Yeah.
Here, Alex.
My name is Alex, and I'm a development economist in the Business and Economics Department. I guess I'm not really having a question, some response, maybe making two remarks. And I like the topic of today, which is about decarbonization and decolonization. It's really about poverty, how climate change is affecting other people, and how we care about other people. But if you think about climate change, in some way, if we use the other words, like global warming, is happening everywhere in the world. And I think that one of the, as an economist, I think our economic instinct is really important. And one of the most important, most natural instinct of human beings is we feel our pain. We don't feel other people's pain, right? And the pain that we feel actually is here right now in the space. That if global climate change is going to continue to happen, that the world is getting warmer and warmer. We will not have New York City in the water, right? Florida is going to be, in many places, going to be flooding, right? We have California getting more snow for a short period of time. And in the Midwest, there will be more storm and, different things that will hit different parts of the world, the states. And that will be human cost, it will be financial cost. So I want to stress that, when I talk about here, that we do surveys and communities, do we actually don't know the cause of all these economics or externality, right? We actually feel that in our own communities, not only among people far away. So if you think about who are the most vulnerable to climate change, it's actually anyone in the world. So we feel our pain. And I think this is something that we have to remind ourselves that this is why we have to act. We take care of ourselves as well as people far away, together as a human race. This is my number one response, and my number two response will be what about I have a question or comment about what about developing countries, how they will still have to think about how to have better economic growth and more food, more fun, more different things for their family and people. And if you look at the economic transformation happening across the world, usually the way to get rich is to move away from the agricultural sector into manufacturing, and go to service sector, right? So this is how Japan and Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, later in China, these days also in different parts of like Southeast Asia and India and so on, right? In Africa, they're building more country, right? So like it will speed up the pace that less developed country, they can get rich faster in a less damaging way. I think one of the very important investment we can make is like human capital investment, that we invest more in the education and training of like people, the generation, particularly for girls and women, so that they will be able to do more things, not just to work in factories and this kind of manufacturing, but do more modern economy, and hopefully that will be less damaging to the environment, and also that we go getting into faster economic growth. In that way, I think we can do more education investment across the world. That's my two quick responses as a development concept. Thank you for your presentation sharing, and I like this today's event very much.
Well, thank you all, and I just want to express my thanks to our panelists. So if we could give them a round of applause. Thanks, Pat, for the hand clap up there in the corner. Flexing some Zoom knowledge right there. Also, just want to invite you all, if you have any additional questions or any follow-up that you have for any of our panelists, you're more than welcome to get in contact with me. I have their contact information. I know that they, as alum, are more than happy to entertain questions you have about their own vocational journeys, how they got from here to where they are now. But certainly feel free to follow up with me about that. We all want to invite you all at this point, if you want to stick around and see the second half of our show this evening, which is the Hunger Intern poster session. On your way in, you may have seen our Hunger interns who have returned from the field from their internships in December of last year and are going to be graduating in May of this year. An important part of their journey is to share their learning with our community. And they have done a really excellent job, each of the 14, in summarizing some of their main learnings among many, many different things that they've learned as a part of their independent study research that they've done as majors. So what you'll see is evidence of their learning in their particular field of study in their discipline as a Hunger intern. So if you want to go and see what that looks like, we invite you to stick around. Apparently there's also a lot of cupcakes and eclairs and all kinds of stuff out there. I'm not sure what that's about, but you can eat too. So we thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate your attention. For those of you that brought your plants, you can take them home with you. You don't have to leave them. But there are plants that were already here. Don't take those. Okay? Leave the plant friends that were here when you came in. Thank you again to our panelists. We really appreciate your time. If Kat and Ryan, if you just stick around for 1 second, that'd be great. Don't zoom out just yet. But thank you again.